There used to be an ad on TV about people wanting to choose the correct super. We were told to compare the pair. We were given two different people to compare with the same income, same super contribution, same stuff, but one ended up much better than the other, so make sure you invest in the right super. Well, here in the second half of Romans chapter 5, Paul tells us to compare the pair. It's two blokes, same flesh and blood, but that's where the comparison ends, because then he turns to comparison, to contrast them. One person was disobedient, which led to death. The other person was obedient, which led to life. And whoever we put our trust into will end up either in death or life. Paul is contrasting here Adam, the first human, and Jesus Christ. And what we'll see by the end of this passage is that Jesus came into the world as the second and greater and better Adam to rescue us from our sin and death. Last week we saw Paul laying out gloriously the amazing love that God has for us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. We are saved completely and purely and utterly through Jesus Christ's grace. And Paul expounds on that in the next verses by contrasting how different Adam and Jesus are. But firstly, he lays out the problem of Adam and sin. This problem began with Adam. It spread to everyone, which led to universal death. Look with me from chapter 5, verse 12. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. Let's pause there, because we can read about the origin of sin in Genesis chapter 3, in the events called the fall. Adam and Eve completely disobeyed God by eating the fruit from the tree which they weren't allowed to eat from. They disregarded God's loving rule, his kingship, and decided to be their own masters. But this wasn't just an isolated event that we can read about and think that's a nice story. No, the events of Genesis chapter 3 have a universal impact on the rest of humanity. When sin and rebellion entered into the very good creation, it had universal consequences. The consequence which Paul wants us to note here particularly is that every human being born after Adam and Eve were born into sin. Yes, born into a world of sinfulness, but born into sin themselves. Psalm 51:5 says this: "Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me." We are born with a default state of wanting to be our own gods. We are born with a default state of wanting to reject God's rule and wanting to be our own ruler, as we've seen already in this series. Now, some people find this notion of original sin hard to hear. And it is confronting. Some people question whether it's fair or not. But whether it's fair or not isn't the question that Paul is answering here. He's answering the question of, is this real or not? And I don't think we even need to look at Genesis 3 or Romans to see this at play. If we look at the course of human history, are we getting morally better or worse? It's surely not upwards. Why do we see so much war around the world? Why do we see prideful leaders? Why do we see things closer to home such as domestic violence? Because of original sin. Because of Adam. because our hearts were ugly. A default state of wanting to live against God's rule. Now on the factory line for things such as cast iron, you have moulds which you pour the cast iron into, the molten iron into, and everything from that mould conforms to the shape of that mould. If that mould is faulty or incorrect, then every other object that follows it will have the same flaw and fault. And it's the same with us and Adam. Adam is our prototype, which we are born into. Sin brought about death, and death spread throughout creation. And this was even before God gave us the law. Look with me from verse 13. For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, who was the type of the one who was to come. Now, we need to remember here that Paul was writing to a bunch of Christian Jews as well as Gentiles. And the Jews could have tried to get around this problem by saying, we can just go back to the law, which would save us. But Paul is saying here that the law doesn't save people, it just exposes to them what sin is. You see, death and sin happened before the law. And sin and death still happened after the law. So the law won't help you. And still sin happens in our own lives today. Because if we take a good hard look at ourselves, it doesn't take all that good hard look to see sin in us. The ugliness in our hearts, the urge to look good and feel good no matter what. The urge to lie if it protects us, the urge to put ourselves and our own lives first, the urge to express our sexuality in ungodly ways, the urge to be selfish with our finances and our stuff and our time. It's there. It's universal. You know, as I was training for ministry, our group was asked the question, why do you want to go into ministry? And I distinctly remember someone else saying, to help people see that deep down people are good. Well, I remember their thinking, actually, I'm here to help people to see that deep down people are bad. And we desperately need a saviour. And that's what Paul is writing here. We are helpless in sin and death, dead in the line of Adam. We are walking corpses. Not just physical death, but eternal judgment. But there is hope, brothers and sisters, isn't there? There is someone who is like Adam, but so much greater and better. See, Jesus came. God came to be born, to put on flesh, to become incarnate in order to come and cover the consequences of Adam's fall. Yes, we were dead in sin, but grace triumphs. Now, last summer, my wife Rach and I, we went to a Big Bash game at the Gabba. It was a crazy match. It was the biggest run chase ever, the most sixes, 2 centuries. It was mental, but it went down to the last 2 deliveries. It was a bit of an arm wrestle. It was an edge-of-the-seat moment, and in the stadium, it was silent for every ball of that last over, waiting with anticipation as to what was to come, who was going to win. And sometimes we can think of grace like this. That it's a battle between grace and sin, that it's an arm wrestle, that it might have a different result either way. But in these next verses, Paul tells us that it is the complete opposite. Grace has completely wiped the floor with sin. Grace has completely triumphed over sin. Like an ashes whitewash, sin has no hope of winning over grace. Grace is completely over and abundant. In verses 15 to 17, Paul is here setting up a list of contrasts to help us understand that the grace of Christ is completely different from the sin of Adam. It's different in its degree, and it's different in its consequences. Look with me from verse 15. But the gift is not like the trespass. For if the many died by the trespass of one man, how much more did God's grace and the gift that came by the grace of that one man, Jesus Christ, overflow to the many? Nor can the gift of God be compared with the result of one man's sin. The judgment followed one sin and brought condemnation. But the gift followed many trespasses and brought justification. You see, Paul is saying that grace, the free gift, isn't like the sin, the fall of Adam, because in the degree or level of grace, it is so much greater than the level or degree of Adam's sin. Though many died through Adam's sin, many will live because of the one death of Jesus Christ. And Adam only did one sin originally, but Christ's death covers a multitude of sins. The sins that followed Adam. You know, just imagine the sheer amount of grace that needs to exist to cover the sins of the world. You know, imagine sitting down and writing on a Word doc every sin that you have committed. Every act of disobedience, big and small. I wonder how many A4 pages would that be in a 12-spaced New Times Roman double-spaced font? I think mine would get down to Bathurst here from Brisbane with the number of pages. Now imagine that multiplied by the number of people who are in the room watching this at the moment. If you were to line up all of that sin, how many pages would that be? Just imagine the magnitude of that. Now, what if we did this for all the Christians in the central west of New South Wales, or all the Christians in Australia, or all the Christians in the world alive right at this moment? Extend that further. Now add on the people who have followed God all throughout history. All the people who have trusted in God before Jesus, and then all the Christians who are to come. There's not enough paper in the world for all of that. There's not enough trees. It's inconceivable the amount of sin that exists right now, that has existed in the past and will exist in the future, and yet God's grace covers it all. Jesus took all of that sin in his body on that cross. All of that sin would be wiped away. The sinners justified. There is not an amount of sin that Jesus' grace does not cover. There's not a type of sin that Jesus' grace can't cover for the repentant person. And yet we can fall so often into the trap and thought pattern when we are wrestling with our sinful nature that maybe God can't forgive that last sin. Or maybe we are just too far gone for God's grace. Or maybe we sometimes think that we need to prove ourselves worthy of God's love or grace. We slip into legalism and think that we need to be law keepers to try and cover sin. But friend, if God's grace and love overabounds and overflows for all who trust in him, why would it stop with you? If God's grace stretches so far and wide and high and low and triumphs over sin, why would it stop with you? His forgiveness is unending. His mercies are new every morning. There's no arm wrestle between sin and grace. Grace completely blows sin out of the water. A complete thrashing, a complete whitewash and victory. And the consequences that it brings are different. Verse 16, Adam's sin brought condemnation, judgment, shame, guilt, a heavy weight, an impossible burden. It brings death. But God's grace brings justification, a clean slate, us being made right with God, forgiveness, freedom, joy. And if you notice here, it's a free gift. Paul repeats this 5 times in this verse. It's a free gift, it's a free gift, it's a free gift, it's a free gift. It's a free gift. God's grace towards us in Jesus Christ, which triumphs over sin, isn't bought, it isn't earned, it isn't redeemed with a coupon, it isn't debited from our bank account, it doesn't require a payment, it doesn't earn interest, it doesn't need afterpay. It is a free gift. It's the gift of life. Look with me from verse 17. For if by the trespass of one man death reigned through that one man, how much more will those who receive God's abundant provision of grace and the gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ? Let's continue on verse 18. Consequently, just as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all people, so also one righteous act resulted in justification and life for all people. For just as through the disobedience of the one man the many were made sinners, so also through the obedience of one man many will be made righteous. Yes, we were dead in sin, dead in Adam, because his sin led to universal consequences and condemnation and death. But the cross, the one act of righteousness of Jesus, had eternal consequences. See, grace triumphs at the cross. Life triumphs over death at the cross. Freedom triumphs over shame and guilt at the cross. Jesus triumphs over the devil and death at the cross. And that's why Jesus came. To free us from the reign of death, from being slaves to death. To bring us to life with him. And that's what we celebrate here on Ascension Day. That Christ isn't dead, but Christ is alive and well. Victorious over sin and death. Seated at God's right hand, reigning. And he will come again one day to deal the final blow. So then, friends, compare the pair. Adam leads to death. Jesus leads to life by a superabundant and triumphant grace. So then today, who are you following? Death or life? Have you turned to Jesus with your whole heart and living with him as King? You might say, Michael, I'm a Christian. Of course I do. But sometimes we can fall into the trap that sometimes we need to justify ourselves. Sometimes we try and top up his grace by doing good stuff. But trusting in ourselves and our own actions and law following will never work. It'll just only lead to further shame and guilt and lead to death. But remember that grace has completely triumphed over sin, wiped the floor with it. So friends, revel in that grace. Revel in that free gift. And if you haven't yet today, if you haven't accepted that free gift, well, today is a great day to do that. Amen.